Welcome to this Young Minds session, social media, online activity and mental health. I hope you find this useful and that you leave feeling a little bit more confident or with perhaps a little bit of new information about how to support young people in their use of technology and working towards them having increased understanding of the possible impact that their use of technology has on their mental health and their emotional well-being. What we know is that adolescence is a period of massive change and it pretty much impacts all areas of young people's life. It's a huge time of development. The adolescent brain is changing and remodeling itself at the quickest rate after the first couple of years of a baby's life. And we know that this development, this continuing to change, continues into the early 20s. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that helps make good decisions and prioritise. It's kind of like the orchestra conductor that helps direct everything, the control centre. And this is the last part of the brain to finish its redevelopment. And so whilst this is in redevelopment, tweens and teens tend to rely on a different part of their brain that is developing quicker, which is the emotional side of the brain. And so what we know is that there's very often a mismatch between the emotional and the cognitive regulatory modes within the adolescent. So when we think about this in the context of social media, that might mean posting a picture that's embarrassing to themselves or somebody else without actually pausing to think through the consequences, or without the ability to imagine how their how their actions might impact somebody else, or how it might feel in a year's time or 2 years' time, or even in 2 weeks' time. When it comes to gaming, it might mean playing all night instead of actually having the sort of self-control and the foresight to get some homework done and to get enough sleep. There's also a tendency to see situations as final and forever, which again, in the light of use of social media, it might mean that if somebody makes a cruel comment and someone else agrees, it can appear like an indisputable truth that everybody agrees with and that will never change. Younger teenagers are developing the ability to see others' perspectives. And of course, in life, this is a really important skill. But with an increased focus on peer approval, it can also lend itself to more of a preoccupation about what others think about them. We know that even in healthy adolescence, there's a huge amount of shifting and changing, and I think we can all agree that they can be quite turbulent times. Young people need to learn to distance themselves from their parents and carers. They need to establish new boundaries and challenge authority, and they need to go through that in order to sort of come out the other side as independent adults who've worked out quite a lot of the way the world works, and to be able to look after themselves and make decisions for themselves. And that will include having a sense of identity and having understood, who they wish to be in life and what some of their views are and how they value friendships and how they judge friendships, and work out their own sense of self-worth, sort of create their own identity. This can involve periods or an ongoing sense of disillusionment. There are some young people who feel the loss of childhood protection and feel sort of the new responsibilities as quite overwhelming, or perhaps they don't feel ready for them. And again, we can probably imagine or picture that there are some young people who in some situations or on some days appear to be incredibly mature, and then 5 minutes later or the next week seem to be far less mature and need much more adult support. This particular picture I absolutely love because I think it represents such a huge, I think we'll all recognise exactly sort of the representation of the way that we see all of these online pictures that other people post. And I think even as adults, even as quite mature adults, we know in part of our brain that the pictures we see, the perfect side, the best side, the unflawed side, whilst we know that that's not necessarily the whole picture, it's really easy to forget that as we scroll, or we're bombarded, or somebody's posted 37 holiday snaps that all look fabulous. it's really easy to forget, even if we know the whole truth and perhaps what's going on behind the scenes. But when we think about the teen brain already kind of tuned to feeling more vulnerable about what others think about them, really having that peer approval sort of at the top of their radar, then of course it's understandable and natural that the way they use social media can definitely impact on the way they feel about themselves. They're more likely, as I say, to see absolute truths and those emotional responses to social stimuli that really aren't easily regulated or contextualized. And whilst just as we know that the pictures don't necessarily show the whole story, lots of teenagers still know it, but it doesn't stop them having that reaction that, of course, everybody else's life is better than theirs. So if we were doing this face-to-face, I might do a little quiz to find out how many of these you recognise. And just if you're curious, I will go around them in the number order. We've got Snapchat, Facebook, OnlyFans, YouTube, WhatsApp, TikTok, Instagram, Chat Roulette, Discord, Fortnite, Twitter, and Tinder. Now, actually, I always say that it doesn't really matter what's on this screen. If I had done this presentation 2 years ago, the icons would be different. If I came back in 2 years' time, the icons would be different. And the really, really important message about this is we need to keep our ear to the ground. We need to keep conversations open. We need to ask. We need to be curious. We need to listen to what our young people who we're working with or we're supporting are using. Because what we know is that those young people, particularly those that we're worried about in real life, chances are, if we're concerned about their mental health, or we're really worried about some of the company they're keeping or some of their behaviours in real life, the chances are incredibly high that this behaviour is being played out in some way online as well. So it's about asking, listening, being curious. And then finding out, if we suddenly hear about a new platform or app or game that we've never heard of before, Google its functionality. Find out how it works, find out what the good bits are, find out what the worrying sides are. There's an American website called Common Sense Media, which gives a fabulous overview of pretty much any game or platform or app. And it tells you why young people are into it. So, for example, TikTok, it will say, sharing songs and dances, and then it will give you some of the warning sides about perhaps privacy settings not being terribly secure, or about, this particular platform might be very slow to block or delete, for example. So as I say, you're probably familiar with some of these, but Google the functionality of others. So I'll give you a quick overview in terms of some of them. So number 8, Chat Roulette. That is a webcam-based platform. You need to have signed up to join it. And if you log into your account, it is like a virtual roulette wheel. You'll spin the wheel, for example, and you can basically be matched with absolutely anybody who happens to be logged in at the same time as you, anybody in the world. So it used to be many years ago that somebody like Justin Bieber would announce that he was going to be on Chat Roulette at such and such a time. And this would understandably, and this is without judgment, encourage tens of thousands of usually young girl fans. But what we know is that about a third of the people on Chat Roulette happen to be naked middle-aged men. So you can see how these platforms can really feed into some very inappropriate places and experiences for young people who really often don't have an idea of what they're letting themselves in for or what they might access. So as I say, I think it's just very much about keeping your ear to the ground and Googling, finding out. Ask young people, what is it that you enjoy? How do you meet people? How do you communicate? And also to be aware that the use of these platforms changes over time. So for example, Facebook, which I'm going to assume most people are familiar with, very, very much started out as joining up with friends or maybe friends of friends. But actually, if we look at the way Facebook is used today, there are still friends on there, but probably we communicate with our close friends via other platforms as well. And Facebook now is full of groups, maybe local community groups. It's full of shops and stores and places to buy stuff. There are political movements, and I'm not suggesting this is wrong, but it's evolved over time in terms of the way we use it. And that's very, very common as well in terms of the way that these platforms evolve over time. So again, when we do this in face-to-face, there's often a discussion about what risks to emotional well-being professionals are concerned about in terms of social media and young people. And usually there are various things that come out of this discussion. Nobody ever says, there are no risks, there are nothing I worry about. The sorts of things that usually come out of conversations include the amount of time young people spend online, the fact that they have access to inappropriate content, and of course that inappropriate content can cover a huge range of things, from hate speech to extreme violence to obviously pornography and sexually explicit content, etc. There's a concern that content is potentially around forever. Less time spent in engaging in real life with people and real life experiences. Cyberbullying is, of course, a huge concern, as is the contact with strangers. So those are the types of things that professionals usually raise in terms of their concerns. And there might well be some others that have sprung to your mind that I haven't covered. So there's ever increasing amounts of research that is coming out. There's always research that's going on, which is obviously really, really interesting and should be taken into account. Keep your eye out for new and updated research. I've just literally picked 3 little snapshots here because I think they're quite interesting. So status of mind, and again, you can look all of these up. This asked young people, thousands of young people up and down the UK, to vote on a range of platforms, but very, very specifically about how they impacted on their emotional well-being. And unsurprisingly, the 2 most picture-centric platforms, Snapchat and Instagram, were ranked lowest for users' well-being. So if we just cast our mind back to that Apple picture, whilst young people are impacted by it, they also know the fuller picture. So just as adults, we know that that's not necessarily, somebody's fabulous holiday pictures, for example. We might well know that that's not the full story, and we might know that their life isn't that perfect, but it doesn't stop it having an impact at the same time. Those 2 things can sit alongside each other. We might understand it, but it still has an impact on us. And actually what's interesting is that's the same for young people. They're not unaware that everybody's lives, aren't necessarily perfect, but it doesn't stop it having an impact. So I thought that was quite interesting. There is a self-awareness there, and that's really important, because when I move on to the strategies, the self-awareness and the understanding is the part that I really want us all to build upon when we're working with young people. The Life and Likes report is the only report that I'm aware of that really focuses on younger children, so the 8 to 12 age group. And of course, we could argue that that's the age group that aren't meant to be using lots of these platforms. But what we also know is that the age restrictions are less than rigorous, should we say. So the Life and Likes report found that children who were still in primary school, sort of the 8 to 10, 11-year-olds who were using social media, tended to use it in a much more playful and friendly way. That doesn't mean there are no instances, obviously, but the generalisation was that they tended to use it in a much more playful and fun way. Also, that their audiences and the people that they followed or liked, or friends, or whichever category, that whatever they're named as on different platforms, tended to be much smaller, because usually children go to smaller primary schools and therefore have a limited sort of social range. However, once they got to year 7 and tended to go to much bigger secondary schools, they themselves reported that they were finding social media much harder to manage. They were becoming over dependent on likes. They felt the pressure to be online all the time and to, to be keeping right up to date with it. Very, very difficult. And there was awareness that they were starting to really need these likes and comments for social validation. And what's also really important is that they also reported that both schools and parents and carers were almost stepping back in terms of their online safety input. So again, there's an awareness there of the impact that it's having. And I think really, really importantly, there was this awareness that the adults were not giving them as much support as they needed. The cyber survey reported that sort of the worst of the most negative aspects were changing. Like I said, some of the ways that we use these platforms has changed, and so some of the worst content, as it were. So young people reported cyberbullying being overtaken by really horrible content that was encouraging kids to either bulk up or reshape your body. So this whole body perfect angle was overtaking in terms of their concerns. Again, unsurprisingly, but really importantly, vulnerable young people, or those young people that adults had concerns about in real life, were found to be far more likely to be pressurized or blackmailed into sharing nudes. Again, if you are in a role that's providing pastoral support to a young person or a group of young people, then somebody needs to be having a conversation with them about what is going on in their online world, just as we are, or you guys are investing a huge amount of time in supporting them in their real life activity. And of course, I use these words in inverted commas because young people really don't seem to have the boundaries, or there aren't the boundaries that we often see or view our real life and our online life. These are totally interchangeable without established boundaries. It's just life for young people. So if you're concerned about young people in what you're seeing face to face, then the support really needs to be there in terms of their online behaviour as well. So thinking about the more practical side, about what can we do about all of this? I'm sure we've all got concerns and things that we really dislike about the online space. So what actually can we do to really, really help and support our young people? And I think I view the way forward is it's got to be education and empowerment. And again, there's a whole host of pictures here about the things that we are very comfortable about educating about. So if we take the example of, I've got here, the Green Cross Code and learning to swim. If we think about the way that we teach young people, children, to swim across a road, at first we wouldn't dream of letting them even be near a pool or a busy road without holding on to them very, very tightly, or having an aid that, is keeping them afloat. And then gradually, as their skills and their age and their understanding develops, and they earn our trust so that we have some predictability about their behaviour, then what we can do is just be next to them without physically holding on to them. And then slowly, slowly, we can start practicing, and we can build up an increased sense of trust and independence until we reach a stage where actually they are good enough swimmers that we trust them, they can go to the pool with a group of friends. Or actually, yes, we trust them that they're able to walk to school on their own because we trust that they're able to cross those 3 roads. And actually, unfortunately, what we know is this doesn't reduce risk entirely, but we have to find that balance in life when the risk is sufficiently reduced. And I would suggest that we absolutely have to adopt the same sort of road of education in terms of social media. And that means preventative education. It means, really, really working with young people before we allow them to use social media without any sort of parental guidance. I think in the past, very often, education has been reactive rather than preventative. And what we know actually is that preventive education is massively impactful. If we look at the way underage or teenage pregnancy rates have fallen, over the last couple of decades, it's fallen by over 60%. There's massive evidence that says that building knowledge and skills and resilience and aspirations of young people, as well as providing easy access to welcoming services, really helps them to make much more empowered decisions around enjoying healthy and consensual relationships and using contraception to avoid unplanned pregnancy. So that's just one example of evidence of really sort of wraparound preventative education. And I really believe that we should be using the same ideas in terms of our input in terms of social media and online activity. And as I've just said, I think we really need to work on being preventative rather than reactive. And for those of you who are working in schools, this is just a very brief nod to the fact that online safety always sat in the computing curriculum, and there was very much focus on privacy settings. Now, obviously, privacy settings are important. I'm never going to suggest that they aren't, but I am so in favour of this new component of the PSHE curriculum, which looks at the emotional impact of online lives and behaviour and activity. And I'm really pleased that it's been brought into this compulsory and very much, as I say, wrapped up in the emotional well-being aspect of the curriculum. Of course, it needs to be taught properly, just like any of the PSHE curriculum needs to be done, thought through, because there is the potential for all sorts of disclosures. There are the potential for quite awkward conversations or maybe embarrassing conversations. So these sessions really do need to be planned well. But I'm really pleased that it's come out of computing and sits much more in the social and emotional health aspect of the curriculum. So thinking about what is it we want to achieve in terms of supporting our young people with their digital use, digital lives. I mean, however much we wish to or might wish to, technology's here to stay. We might very well look back with rose-tinted glasses at the olden days, etc., but we really need to move on from that. It's here to stay. And actually, there are some amazing benefits to it, and we'll look at the benefits in a couple of minutes. But really, what is it that we're looking to achieve? Schools are a perfect setting for primary preventative strategy because obviously we spend such a long time with young people. We know that there are a lot of parents who don't necessarily feel confident or maybe are able to manage all of the behaviour. And, young people spend such a huge amount of time in schools with their peers that it's a perfect setting. I am really keen that it includes the looking at the emotional well-being side and really thinking about and encouraging the use of technology in positive, meaningful ways, which are endless. While some of our concerns also, we could argue, are endless, actually, so are the benefits. So, I think we really need to move towards really promoting some of the fantastic ways we can use technology. We do need to move on from focusing solely on safety and policing, and actually that sort of almost punishment, taking away restrictive approach that, again, we often hear about. We know that doesn't necessarily work at all. What it leads to very often is subversive behaviour. So those parents who insist on following their children on whatever platform they're using, I would suggest that works for a certain amount of time, particularly if they're in primary school. It might feel completely appropriate if you've got a much younger child, but actually it will get to an age or stage, which will vary with the individual, where that young person does not want their parent or carer following them and seeing everything. And if the parent or carer refuses to move or unfriend them or whatever the platform language is, the children are very likely just to go and set themselves up a different account under a different name. And of course, the chances of them setting their privacy policies, settings are reduced. So this sort of policing that sometimes people insist on, it only has a certain shelf life. And actually, again, if we go back to sort of thinking about how we teach children to cross roads, we're not policing our 18-year-olds to cross roads. We're not insisting on holding their hands. And, you know, we have to give them their independence and allow them to move forward in an independent way without us constantly holding their hands. What we also know is that shock tactics also don't really work, whilst we know that there are some terrible, terrible stories out there. Very occasionally we might do a workshop, you know, on some of those stories, but actually throwing those stories at young people all the time just lose their impact. So I think sometimes we need to think about the way we are framing our education and our input, and make sure that we're not constantly focusing on sort of the shock tactics, the policing, the restrictions. So what can we do to help? I think it's really important to make sure that the session is planned. Now, this might relate to a whole class session, a whole year group session. It might, you know, it might be a whole assembly, for example, or it might be a much smaller session. It might be a one-to-one session. But just like anything where there's a really big potential for disclosures or uncomfortable conversations, or indeed somebody getting incredibly upset or perhaps angry, you know, the more that we as professionals spend planning it, the better, you know, and really think about the space, the group size, and give ample time. I think it's also incredibly important that we set a set of ground rules and really do the very best that we can to make sure that the young people feel that they're in a safe space, and to remind them about anonymizing stories, for example, and only share with care, and all the things that we might also do if we're having any sort of conversation where there's chance for emotions to run high. I think it's really important to acknowledge how difficult the pressure can feel. Again, very, very, very often young people, if they're talking to adults, might meet an adult who dismisses it all as a waste of time, ignore it, it's ridiculous, don't listen to them. It's very, very easy to dismiss it all, particularly if it's not something that we feel passionate about, or we didn't grow up with, or whatever. It's very easy just to flick it away. And actually, we need to understand that this feels real. This is their life. And if everybody in their year group's doing something or whatever, then this is real. This is real pressure. And it's incredibly important just to acknowledge that. I understand how hard it is to keep up with all of this. Just that sentence goes an awful long way to helping that young person think, okay, she or he might be old, but they get it. They get it. They've shown me that they understand some of it. This pressure is real, full stop. So it's really important to validate it. I think if we're working alongside young people for an amount of time and we're sort of making progress, do encourage them to limit notifications, take short breaks. I think the goal that we're working towards when we're doing any sort of emotional wellbeing support, I think our ultimate goal is self-awareness, self-understanding. If we're going to use an example, let's say, of anxiety, if we're supporting a young person in managing their anxiety, the goal will be at the end of the day, in terms of, you know, when they're adults or when they leave school or whatever setting, is that they have got enough self-awareness and self-understanding that they can perhaps manage this on their own, that they understand their triggers, they understand their strategies. And exactly the same would be in terms of thinking about social media use. The goal is that our young people are aware of the impact it has. They're aware that they might be spending too much time. They're aware that all these pings and red lights or whatever the notifications are, they are designed by psychologists to grab our attention. There's no it's not coincidence that they're red and that they ping and that triggers some sort of dopamine rush in our brains. These are really well designed. So I think we really need to help our young people on a journey of self-awareness in understanding. And it might be that you set the year group or whatever, whichever, you know, where you're working, encourage them to take short breaks and see if they can link the behaviour and the feelings afterwards. If they can't manage a break for more than a day, that in itself is interesting. It's not a failure, it's interesting, it's something to be explored. What was it that drew you back? What were your feelings? And then if other people were able to, have a break for a day, a week, or whatever it was, see if they can join the dots. And did it lead to an increased conversation with people that you live with? Did it help you sleep better? We really need to help them discover all of this. And as I say, sort of keep joining the dots. In terms of thinking about online behaviour, sort of sadly and happily, there are a million examples out there of other people's behaviour that we can use as a starting point for discussions. We are aware that there are endless, easily accessible examples of really revolting behaviour. All you need to look at is perhaps somebody famous's Instagram post, look at all of the comments underneath, and what you'll find is random people entering into, really horrible arguments with each other. And obviously you would have to choose your examples carefully in terms of the language, in terms of the content, and in terms of the age and stage of your pupils. But the point I'm trying to make is there are endless examples out there we can use, rather than looking at the group of the behaviours of the group of students that you're working with. Most young people are going to find that incredibly invasive and embarrassing if we're suddenly looking at the online argument that happened with, 6J yesterday. That immediately is going to put all sorts of defences up. Whereas young people, for everybody, finds it much easier to talk about somebody else's behaviour. There are loads of resources out there. There is a documentary on BBC One about Jessie Nelson, one of Little Mix, who talks about her online bullying. There are sections of that programme that would provide fantastic starting points if it was age appropriate for some of your students. There is a much more recent programme for older students that David Baddiel did on BBC only this week. Some really interesting parts of that could be used as discussion starting points. So as I say, the good side is that we've got a limitless set of resources that we can use as starting points of conversations. Pass resources on to young people. We know that these conversations can be really uncomfortable. Talking about, let's say, pornography and sexually explicit content is really, really uncomfortable for lots of adults. Let's not, deny that, unless you're very experienced and well-trained, let's say for PSHE education. This can be really, really uncomfortable. I know as a parent, it's really uncomfortable. However, there are loads of really, really good resources that we can pass on. It might be that you ask young people to watch a certain film, let's say the cup of tea consent video, just as an example. Might be that you ask them to watch that at home for a piece of homework and jot down their thoughts, jot down the good things about it, the bad things. Did it miss anything out? Is it too clear cut? Are there other nuances when we're thinking about consent? But we don't all have to sit and watch it in the same room, or sit and open up a conversation about consent, let's say. So that's just one idea, but there's plenty of resources out there that we can pass on to our young people. There might be a time and a place that we need to make young people aware of the law. Again, obviously age and stage appropriate, but certainly revenge porn, for example, there is a law against it, and it might be that we need to make them aware of the law. Whilst we often hear that social media is kind of the root of all evil and to blame for everything, I think there's a huge amount of messages that we get from TV, from advertising, basically from all over the place, that needs to, on a whole school level, be challenged, be questioned, be debated as part of sort of the school ethos. There's such a massive amount of subliminal messaging that, or not even necessarily subliminal, that are thrown to young people. It's not all through social media, and I think there's so many divisiveness and conversations that we need to be having as part of our sort of ongoing emotional well-being education within the whole school setting that that needs to be prioritized. So I don't think it's just social media. I think there's all sorts of things that if we can open up the debates and challenge would help our young people navigate life maybe with a little bit more confidence. I think the final point I've actually covered in the others, keeping conversations open and neutral. So again, not pointing at what did you do, what did you feel, but imagine how this person might feel. For lots of young people feels much more comfortable, as I say, talking about what the people in the film did or said or might feel. For some people will be much more comfortable. Other people are very happy to share their own experiences, and of course that's great as long as they feel safe and secure and we respect the confidentiality of what they are sharing. Other people are, wild horses wouldn't make them talk about their own experiences within a group, and that's absolutely fine. We've got so many other strategies to be able to use to still have those conversations. And I suppose the opposite side of me recommending strategies will, the other side of the coin is there are some pitfalls. There are some things that we would encourage you to avoid, although whilst I say this, this doesn't mean that any professional, myself included, has never sort of avoided a mistake, obviously. But I suppose if we're aware of the common pitfalls, then we can go into these sessions a little bit more forewarned. So very, very rarely does, bombarding a young person with 20 questions. This would be particularly pertinent if an incident has come to light. Very rarely does 20 questions, elicit the sort of response that we want. So, try and listen to their reality. Try not to bombard with questions. Try and unpick perhaps stories, with a little bit more care, listening very carefully. But, let's try and remind ourselves not to suddenly fire 20 questions at a group of young people. Again, sometimes people, particularly people of my age group and generation who didn't grow up with this, it's very, very easy to sort of roll our eyes and say, oh, all young people, you're all, glued to your phone, you're all addicted, such a waste of time. It's very easy to belittle it all. This is reality. This is what they've grown up with. And let's not belittle the young people about being attached to their phone, addicted to their phone, because I guarantee that, we can look at, again, people of my generation, and they're never far from their phone either. You only have to sit in a waiting room or get on public transport to see that pretty much everybody is glued to their screen. So I think it's incredibly unfair, not very helpful, to be belittling young people. And it is their reality, which leads into just telling them to switch off their device is not going to go very far at all. I can see that the formatting on the next box is not ideal, but again, blaming everything on social media. There are all sorts of messages and pressures that young people have, and I don't think social media is the root of all evil. It certainly is another ingredient in the pot, but there are plenty of other things going on as well. And again, I don't think it's particularly helpful just to blame everything on social media. I don't think it serves a great purpose. And again, dismissing the fact that the pressure and the impact are real. This is their reality, whether we like it or not, whether we've got rose-tinted memories of our own childhood. This is real life, and so us dismissing it or harping on about how life used to be is, as it's immaterial. And again, sort of trying to explain that online and offline worlds are very different. There's very rarely a solid boundary between them, and I think we need to develop a more nuanced understanding about some of these boundaries. We very often separate out into the bad side and we can see the good side. And of course, there's massive nuance boundaries in between the two. So let's think, for example, for a moment of inappropriate sexual content. Okay, I think we could all agree that there's a huge amount we wouldn't want our young people accessing. But what about those young people who've heard words, heard phrases, heard things, and go online to find out what it means? We did the same when we were children, or I'm speaking for myself here. Unfortunately, for my generation, we just had to go and look it up in a dictionary. those young people go and put the words, the phrases, the things that they've heard in onto a Google search, and within milliseconds, they might well have found an all singing, all dancing video, which actually they really weren't expecting. Now, the behavior and the motivation hasn't changed between my generation and theirs. What they find within milliseconds massively has changed. So whilst, you know, as I say, we can talk about the bad side and the good side, what about the inquisitive, the fun, the slightly risky? Where does all that behaviour sit in with this? And as I say, those boundaries are a little bit more blurred and nuanced. So thinking about how we as a setting might well sort of approach all of this and think about all of this, again, I would shy away from thinking it's just one person's responsibility, whilst there may well be a PSHE teacher or a group of them, I still think that it's really important to think about this across the board, because all of this sits alongside whole school ethos that really prioritises emotional well-being, that works to develop good self-esteem, good social and coping skills, you know, to encourage independence. And I think the schools that are very successful in doing that, thinking about resilience, and as I say, having this whole school ethos where everybody has this at the forefront of their aims and goals, this feeds into and will impact on good social media, sort of, you know, all of it goes together in terms of, I suppose, raising really well-rounded young people. If there's an atmosphere where young people can have open, non-judgmental conversations around a whole host of issues, again, this will not only feed into their real lives and developing into emotionally resilient young people, but it will also impact on how they behave online. As far as you're comfortable to, what's a really, really powerful strategy is to actually talk about how social media impacts on yourself. Now, obviously, I would never encourage a professional to open up about anything deeply personal or triggering or emotional with a group of students, but there might very well be something at a sort of not terribly deep level that you are happy to share. So for example, when I shared with a group of students I was working with how I followed a range of people at my gym because I got on well with them, I had laughed with them, always said hello to them at the gym, so I felt like I knew them. When I started to follow them online, I was then suddenly bombarded with all of these pictures with videos of their workouts, pictures of their abs, every meal they had. And the impact, not that that's wrong, they of course are entitled to share whatever they want to. The impact it had on me was that I instantly felt guilty, that I wasn't at the gym, that I wasn't working out hard enough, that I wasn't eating the right stuff. And actually, when I started to then not necessarily follow them, that impact was lessened. Now, when I had that conversation with young people, it suddenly opened the door. I think what it allowed them to do is, again, show that I got it, show that actually my reaction was completely natural and human. There's nothing wrong with my reaction. Many of us would have reactions to different soft spots, whatever you want to call it, your Achilles heel, you know, whatever angle of life it is. But we would all have that reaction to something. And it showed the young people that it's a normal, it's a human, it's a natural reaction. And actually it's okay to talk about it. And suddenly they're going, yeah, there's somebody in my year who posts all about this, and this person makes me feel like this. And actually just open up that conversation, would completely open the door. And as I say, it allowed them to see that it was completely natural and that we will all have it over certain topics. Right, so the last point about encouraging students to reflect on past actions, this is the main strategy I use. Instead of asking young people to, how are you going to feel when you're 20 about this? What's this going to look like when you're looking for a job? Which is, again, very, very, very often the way we approach conversations about content lasting forever. We will ask them to feel, to hypothesize about how they're going to feel in 6 years' time. Young people can't. You know, when I was 14, could I imagine what I felt would feel like when I was 18? Absolutely no way. It's a really difficult thing to do. So it's kind of not the most useful strategy. If, however, you talk to young people about, again, choosing the topic sensitively. If you talk to them about how 3 years ago they had the most gigantic argument with their friend and they were furious and upset about it and hated them for a week, and now look, ever since then you've been best friends again, they will be able to relate to how they felt at the time. They will still be able to remember how upset or how angry or how horrible it was, and actually also be able to see that that didn't last forever. They're good friends again. It blew over and things feel very different now. So, I mean, obviously you choose an example very sensitively, but they will be able to reflect on how that felt and be able to see that now they don't feel any of that anymore. That's far more useful than going, how are you going to feel when you're looking for a job in 6 years' time? Which, as I say, is essentially meaningless. But I think the main goal is, how are we going to help and guide our young people to thrive online? And if we can keep that as our absolute, kind of mission statement, then I think it can really help us frame these conversations. So just a little nod to a little bit of sort of movements, research or whatever out there. So Young Minds, if you go onto the website or you do a Google search for Own Your Feed, this was a sort of piece of work that Young Minds did, where young people go through a quick few questions that are multiple choice to essentially give you an idea of how you use social media. So it might be that you are really creative and put lots of content out there. It might be that you spend a lot of time on social media, but all you do is look at other people's stuff and you rarely post yourself. Now, I'm not suggesting one is better than the other, but there are 4 different categories. It's obviously quite, it puts you into a box, but it helps you kind of work out how you're using it. It's beginning to make the link between the emotional responses, and there's some really interesting sort of guidance ideas. It's very light touch, but the guidance and ideas about how you might change some of your online usage and behaviours. So that's something that you might sort of use as a resource with some of the young people you're working with. The Female Lead is a not-for-profit organisation. It does focus on the role of women, but I would also say that any of their findings and discoveries can be applied for all of your students, even though their focus has been very much on girls and women. But in 2019, there was a really interesting piece of work called Disrupting the Feed. And what the group who did the research realised is that social media was having more of a negative impact on the well-being of teenage girls than it was on teenage boys. And what they encouraged the girls to do was to broaden the type of person that they were following. So, and if you go onto the Female Lead website, there are hundreds of inspirational women to follow. So if you're into sport, there are loads of sports people. If you're into science, technology, I mean, every area of life that you could think of, there are really inspirational people to follow. What was interesting was that once the girls in the study broadened the range of type of person they were following, the improvement in terms of the impact on their emotional well-being improved massively. It didn't necessarily all, all the negatives taken away, but the balance changed enormously and very quickly. As a byproduct, I guess is the best way of describing it, of this, the girls naturally themselves started to limit some of the original people that they were following. So they didn't necessarily stop following all of those people who had perfect lives, perfect bodies, but they naturally sort of thinned it out. And essentially what the research showed was, if you can control the algorithm that is delivering your feed. So if you follow just one type of person that happens to be this perfect world, loads of money, supermodel, whatever category umbrella you want to put it in, the algorithm's just going to give you more and more and more and more of that. If you, however, happen to follow uber clever scientists, let's say, your algorithm is going to give you more and more and more of that. So what I would really encourage everybody to do is to take control of that algorithm. Let's not encourage our young people to just be sort of powerless recipient at the end of it. Young people know that there's an algorithm. They understand that when this person picks up TikTok, they're going to see something different from this person. Unlike if we all turn BBC One on at the same time, we'll all see the same thing. They understand the algorithm. They understand that what they've clicked on, what they've interacted with, what they've searched for, that is what's producing the algorithm. I would encourage everybody, let's take control of that algorithm. If I look up really good quality stuff, if I'm into sport, that's going to increase the algorithm. If I'm into, I don't know, sort of positive mental health messages, for example, that's going to increase the algorithm. I mean, you know, we're not all the same. We all have different interests in different areas. There's just literally a snapshot here. So, you know, if you're into the environment, it might very well be that you follow Greta Thunberg, and of course there's millions of others, but that's going to empower and increase the algorithm in terms of that sort of feed. There's lots of mental health awareness and you know, positive messages in terms of looking after your mental health. If that's something that your young people need, we can guide them in that direction. If you're into sport, for example, so you know, there's a whole load of stuff on the screen. There's also loads of funny stuff. So at the bottom, the two black and white pictures, there's an Australian actress, Celeste Barber, who recreates on the right her funny versions of supermodel pictures or sort of Vogue pictures. What's interesting is, I mean, it's not for everybody, but what's interesting is, apart from the fact that she's very funny, if you look at all of the comments, interestingly, the vast majority of comments are from young people saying, oh, you brighten up my day every day. Of course, this is what I'd look like if I stuck my head out of a moving car window, for example. I'm not suggesting we encourage young people to do that. Or, you know, this is what I look like in my underwear, as opposed to the Vogue model. So actually, what you're hearing is a huge amount of affirmative responses from young people. Again, Stacey Solomon, who is on TV quite a lot, whilst she might very well post a picture of herself after TV makeup has been working for 4 hours, she will also post a picture saying, this is how I woke up this morning, you know, took the makeup artist 3 hours to cover up my spots. But again, the responses she's getting, it very often from young people say, oh, thank goodness for that. I wasn't the only person who woke up with spots today. But the point that I'm trying to make is we can actively influence this algorithm. I want to see schools having, you know, displays of really inspirational people. You know, let's have a look at what Michelle Obama posted last night, for example. But they're in the same way that we pick out really fantastic people who've changed the course of history, and we celebrate, you know, different works of literature and different historical figures. Let's direct our young people to finding inspirational content online. Let's not encourage them to be, as I say, a sort of victim or a powerless recipient of their algorithm. So let's not forget the positives. There are some really important positives out there. We know that there's instant access to such a great amount of information. You know, young people can find all sorts of information. We need to help them to work out how to be able to find trustworthy information. We can't just rely on the fact that they will find themselves in a positive space. So we need to give them those skills. Of course, it's fantastic ease of communication. I mean, the fact that you can FaceTime a relative at the other, you know, or a friend somewhere else in the world is fantastic. And is, you know, compared to how communication used to be, of course, it's amazing. You can chat to a group of friends. And I think I'm probably not the only person who would say it's saved my sanity over the last 2 years, the ease of communication. There's access to all sorts of networks and groups of friends, and there's forums you can meet like-minded people. And of course, this is all fantastic. Again, I think there's still work to be done, conversations to be had to help young people evaluate how healthy those forums and those people that they are communicating with are, because there is also a tendency to identify very quickly with a certain identification of a particular group. So we need to give young people the skills to be, excuse me, discerning in this manner. Excuse me. But of course, there are great positives. There's ways of sort of sharing content, interests, music. There are plenty of entrepreneurs out there. So of course, there are amazing opportunities. For the last point about finding support, again, let's actively encourage our young people to find support in evidence-based and really good organisations. If we've all heard about the horrendous pro-Ana sites and all of those types of forums, which we know are out there. So if we are supporting a young person who is struggling, let's actively make sure that they end up in a really positive online space. Let's not cross our fingers and just hope that they end up in the right space. Because what we know about young people who did find themselves in these forums is that the vast majority of them started their search by looking for support. So we just can't blindly cross our fingers and hope they end up in the right place. There are some fabulous organisations and forums out there, but let's make sure that we actively signpost and play a really, strong role in that guidance. There are so many great resources out there. I mean, this slide could have been 3, 4, 5 slides. I've just picked out a number of these, and you will have these slides to share. So, do have a look at some of these and share them with your colleagues. That brings me to the end of this session. I do hope there's been some useful information for you in there.